The night suddenly exploded with impacting artillery rounds, and along the Rogosov-Pereyaslav road in the northwest area of Yerkovzy, 11 enemy attacks were repulsed between the hours of 22:10 and 0250. The sunrise bore witness to the effectiveness of our defence, as countless bodies clad in khaki brown could be seen lying in heaps before our positions. Burning vehicles littered the landscape, sending plumes of oily black smoke skyward. We received reports that a number of motorized enemy units had been completely destroyed, and the regimental staff proudly released to us a list of captured equipment: 16 heavy and light MGs, 8 heavy artillery pieces, 9 trucks, 2 medical vehicles, 2 fuel vehicles, and 6 ammunition carriers. 400 prisoners were taken, the number increasing to 800 by the 19th of September. A number of detachments from Infantry Regiment 436, which had been assigned to clear remaining enemy forces from the East Bank, had also reached their objectives with only light casualties. During the next few days, we brought in more than 1,000 prisoners while combing the banks of the Dnieper. Convinced that the Soviet Union had lost the war, deserters were stealing boats and crossing the Dnieper in large numbers under cover of darkness, in attempts to distance themselves from the Soviet army. The sight of ragged individuals, either alone or in small groups, approaching our positions with upraised arms became commonplace, and our confidence continued to mount that the war would be over before the first frost. On the 23rd of September, our battalion was attacked by Russian infantry in surprising strength. We were able to repel the assault with light casualties, and the enemy was thrown back, leaving some light field guns and many infantry weapons littering the ground before us. We remained in our positions until word was received that the opposite bank of the Dnieper was clear of enemy forces, and that our division was to be pulled out of this sector. With the end of the fighting to the south and southeast of Kiev, the mounting casualties among our own forces were calculated. Each company had suffered an average casualty rate of 15 to 20%, and a rifle company of Infantry Regiment 437 had, in the previous 2 months, suffered an average of 4 dead, 2 missing, 14 wounded, and 2 sick, totaling 22 men. The strength of our anti-tank company prior to operations had been between 100 and 120 men. The equipment and weapons remained in relatively good condition, and the importance of properly maintaining all military property, as was constantly drilled into us during our basic training, had produced results. The official lines of supply and material between the troops and company headquarters became very informal as the troops learned to live from the land and from captured enemy resources. With the beginning of the rain and mud season, the frontline units quickly learned that the native Russian pony carts were more reliable than the heavy horse-drawn wagons of our own army, which were designed for paved roads. The Russian pannier wagons were used in ever-increasing numbers from captured equipment or, contrary to strict regulations, occasionally requisitioned from civilians without authorization. Our 14th Panzerjäger Company had lost 2 Chenilette prime movers to land mines, and others suffered damage to and wear on motors and tracks. Despite the efforts of our engineers, spare parts became unobtainable, although we searched a distance of up to 100 kilometers throughout the Army and Corps rear areas. The troops had become masters at fending for themselves. From the end of August to the beginning of September, the company attempted to make captured trucks usable. From the vast quantities of captured enemy material left behind by the retreating enemy, especially in the battlefield area of Kanev, our troops were able to assemble a large quantity of serviceable vehicles. The company commander brought in an entire fuel truck, which greatly augmented our inventory of black or unofficial fuel supplies. The Russians possessed large numbers of robust Ford heavy trucks, as well as those of SS manufacture. Those 2 types seemed to make up the entire inventory of trucks possessed by the enemy, and we always chose the American-manufactured Ford whenever possible, as many replacement parts seemed to be always available. Due to this method of salvage and use, our army appeared to consist of vehicles of every type and description from half of Europe, sometimes making it impossible to obtain even the simplest replacement parts. We found ourselves growing envious of the uncomplicated Russian supply system. Although their inventory of weapons and equipment might not have been as varied or as specialized as our own, what they did have was reliable and could be logistically supported almost anywhere. As in all armies, one of the main topics of discussion was the quality and availability of food. Our company field kitchen was able to work wonders as long as the lines of supply were capable of delivering essential items. During one of my visits to the field kitchen, the company cook proudly showed me a cave where hundreds of sausages and smoked meats hung from long poles. I presented the cook with a number of captured Soviet medals and pistols as gifts for the kitchen personnel, and thereafter we were always guaranteed something more substantial than simply what the official system could provide for us. On 25 and the 26th of September, the main body of the division departed the former combat area on the west bank of the Dnieper. Once again, long grey columns wound their way over undulating terrain on the march toward the south. The enemy forces, which had opposed us with tenacity in the previous weeks, had seemingly evaporated before our advance. Throughout the month of October, the division advanced through a Ukraine bedecked with the splendours of fall. The crops had been harvested, tall haystacks and threshing machines dotted the landscape, creating a picture reminiscent of America. We marched in the direction of Kremenchug, which conveyed to us the message that the city of Odessa on the Black Sea was still under siege. Rumours raced throughout the ranks that we and Romanian units had been assigned to capture it. On the 17th of October, we learned that Odessa had fallen. The division wheeled toward the southeast and was assigned the objective of Nikolaev. While en route, we passed through an area of ethnic German settlements that had been established under the direction of Catherine the Great of Russia some 200 years ago, and here we clearly recognized places named after Karlsruhe, Worms, Speyer, Hellenental, and other cities from our homeland. We encountered only women, children, and a few old men, as the Soviets had deported all men of military age. In a simple but clean and strongly built stone house, I located living quarters with a bedroom that could have been seen somewhere in the Pfalz 200 years ago. A wide wooden bed covered with colourful pillows and topped with a large canopy stood inside. The farm women were speaking a dialect that is similar to what one hears in the Pfalz today. Helping ourselves to fresh milk and white bread, we made ourselves totally at ease in these surroundings. Several days later, we crossed the River Bug on a winding pontoon bridge that strained against the current and entered the harbour city of Nikolaev. Together with the company commander and some other men, I had the opportunity to see half-completed armoured cruisers of about 1,000 tons lying in the dry docks. The march continued toward our new objective of Cherson. On the 25th of October, we again crossed the mighty Dnieper, whose waters had drained us of sweat and blood some 100 kilometres farther to the north. It was clear that the Southern Army elements had advanced ahead along the Sea of Azov and were now proceeding toward Rostov, and that we were to link up with them as reinforcement. We soon found ourselves approaching the western outskirts of a forbidding, desolate area known as the Nogai Steppe. After heavy fighting from 26 to the 28th of October, the divisions of the 11th Army had broken through the narrow corridor of Perekop and had thus cleared the way for us to advance into the Crimean Peninsula. As part of Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH Reserve, the 132nd Infantry Division became assigned to von Manstein's army. In breaking through the narrow corridor, it had been possible to employ only limited forces. However, it was now necessary to reinforce the army for a further push into and occupation of the peninsula. As we advanced over the graves of the Tatars, the ancient protectors of the Crimea from northern invaders, we entered a new battlefield. Our division, together with the 50th Infantry Division attached to the LIV Corps, was assigned to pursue the enemy relentlessly toward Bakhchisaray-Sevastopol. It was also necessary simultaneously to sever the road to Sevastopol. The forward elements of the motorized units assembled in preparation for the attack. On the 31st of October, the enemy exhibited signs of full retreat. The advance elements thrust rapidly toward the south in long columns, leaving the horse-drawn units to advance more slowly toward the front. At Kara Naimak, the horses of both an entire infantry and artillery regiment were compelled to drink from a single well, other water sources having been poisoned by the retreating Soviets. The vast numbers of wagons and livestock clustered together left an impression of another time, of invading armies from another century sweeping across the steppe. Our growing sensation of becoming further isolated from the Western world shadowed us into the Crimea. We experienced a severe shortage of water, and the few deeply dug wells and cisterns not poisoned by the retreating enemy contained brackish water that varied from bad tasting to undrinkable. The horses and soldiers had developed an unquenchable thirst as they laboured in the tormenting heat, and the shortage of water for the horses became so critical that even the strongest and healthiest had to be rotated in the harness often. The company mess attempted to make coffee from the brackish water, and sweetening it with saccharin resulted in a horrible-tasting broth that could be consumed only with the greatest amount of willpower. The range of march for the rifle companies and horse-drawn units now averaged 50 to 60 kilometers per day. The motorized reconnaissance and Panzerjäger units were able to make much better time and quickly reached the Alma Valley. Running through the Crimean Peninsula in an easterly direction toward the Black Sea are three large valley ranges, the Alma, Katcha, and Belbek. The northern part of the peninsula is a vast salt steppe. Long basins for salt production were located here, where the water from the Sivash could be easily evaporated, leaving precious salt lining the basins, which was rare and difficult to obtain in many other regions of Russia. During our advance through Ukraine, we noted how salt was used as a source of trade among the inhabitants, and it was more valued here than in our own homeland. Demonstrating the high value placed on this precious commodity, peasant women presented us with platters of salt and bread as an offering of welcome as we passed through villages. The central Crimea is a flat, nearly treeless plain that is nevertheless fertile and well tended. Here, as throughout the entire Soviet Empire, the farms had been placed under the control of the collectives, the kolkhoz establishment. In the winter months, snow and ice storms sweep over the region from eastern Ukraine. The Yaila Mountains lie in the south. They rise steeply from the level centre to a height of 2,000 metres and then fall sharply into the Black Sea on the southern coast. These mountains are thickly wooded, and the valleys running to the north bear heavy vegetation. Fruit plantations are seen here, along with the picturesque villages of the Tatars. We soon advanced to a battlefield whose name was destined to haunt us for many months, Sevastopol. We closed upon its north and northeastern fortresses during the next few days. During the first days of November, we experienced little enemy contact. However, the advanced artillery batteries continued to lay a line of fire on our exposed west flank. On the 2nd of November, detachments from infantry regiments 436 and 437 departed the assembly area in the settlement of Chanishkoy, and soon met strong resistance in the early morning hours. Despite enemy pressure from the left, we advanced in the direction of Adshi-Bulat and pushed through the enemy defences to open the advance route. With the gathering of darkness, the strong enemy pressure on our left flank became more apparent, and the enemy concentrations were dispersed only by heavy artillery fire. It was rumoured that, due to personnel shortages, Russian volunteers from the prisoner of war camps were being used to augment artillery crews. During the night, breakthrough attempts continued to be made by Soviet naval infantry units, and the attacks broke upon our strong defences as the desperate Soviets attempted to push through our lines towards Sevastopol and to the coast. In order to protect the open west flank and silence an enemy shore battery on the Black Sea coast that hindered the advance of the division, units from Infantry Regiment 438 assaulted toward the west and southwest. A small advance unit was later able to reach a decoy position of this battery, where they found wooden artillery barrels pointing menacingly but impotently toward the sky. The Russians were able to conceal the true position of the heavy battery, which was located farther south near Nikolaev. With the onset of darkness, we were successful in taking the outer lying positions of the coastal guns after fierce fighting. an enemy ship operating on the Black Sea was observed, and our puck took it under fire. During the night, the enemy forces abandoned the coastal battery, and the surviving naval units were evacuated from the peninsula in boats to be taken on board the large Soviet ships lying off the coast. Lieutenant Deal from 2 Battalion, Infantry Regiment 438, along with 20 other comrades, met a soldier's death during this operation. It became obvious to us that the Russians held absolute control of the Black Sea, as Soviet warships could be seen silhouetted against the horizon as they cruised freely beyond the reach of our guns. During the previous day's fighting, the Russian Air Force had been seen in enormous numbers. However, Mulder's fighter wing soon swept the sky clear of enemy planes. On the 3rd of November, the advance section of my regiment, consisting of units from the motorized 14th Infantry Panzerjäger Company and the 9th Bicycle Company, advanced upon a small Tartar village southwest of Avel Sheikh at midday, where we discovered an abandoned magazine containing Russian supplies, including numerous cases of papyrosi cigarettes. The advance continued along the Katcha Valley. In the rays of a setting sun, the landscape appeared strikingly beautiful, with a narrow road running along a row of poplar trees and between fruit farms. From a distance of about 1,500 meters, we could observe attractive small Tartar houses, with wooden porches and low roofs sprinkled among the valleys and along the crests of the hills. As we approached the edge of the settlement, the point element came under strong enemy fire, and I immediately opened fire with my pack on a yet unseen enemy in and among the houses. Under cover fire from our gun, the officer in charge of the 9th Company moved forward. Small arms fire began to slam into the house wall behind us, leaving whirling clouds of dust as the bullets pockmarked the mud-coloured buildings near our gun position. Our company commander continued to stand unshaken through the chaos, ignoring the rounds striking the wall behind him, while we lay flat or cowered behind the steel shield of the puck. Through the deafening explosions of the hammering machine guns, I could hear the high-pitched screaming of a wounded soldier, and someone began shouting, "Stomach wound!" The nearest machine gun fired almost continually as the gunner emptied the barrel at swiftly moving targets. We continued to concentrate on loading and firing at the distant figures scrambling between the houses, and the machine gun followed the enemy movements. We attempted to give the impression that we were here in regimental force, and not just a weak advance element with only a rifle company and 2 anti-tank guns. The ruse was successful, and we observed a number of Soviet soldiers dressed in flowing dark blue navy overcoats, withdrawing along the valley floor toward the west to the sea. The wounded lancer lay a few steps behind us on the edge of the road, his upturned helmet a few feet beyond where he lay. A medical assistant knelt alongside him and unbuttoned his dust-caked tunic to bandage the wound. Within seconds, the soldier's screams for help had become unintelligible mumbles as he lay in the dirt. His feverish eyes appeared wide with astonishment against his chalk-white face, and he stared forward into blackness as the shadow of death quickly settled upon him. The medic removed the watch from the soldier's lifeless arm and quickly began gathering personal effects from within the pockets of the ragged, blood-caked uniform. We turned away and busied ourselves with our own thoughts and responsibilities. The thoughts of those gathered nearby remained deeply personal, and one could not escape feeling an intense pity for our brother in the grey tunic who had been struck. Yet with these thoughts, each man turned to concentrate upon himself, about how he could be the next to fall, the next to meet his destiny in Russia. We became, at times, possessed by these thoughts, as helpless against them as against the death that had quickly enveloped our brother soldier. Thus began the realization that we were being consumed by this foreign land. One would hesitate and attempt to suppress these thoughts deep within oneself. During the fighting, these suppressed emotions became entangled with every nerve, and were strained to the breaking point through the repeated experience of indescribable terror. The cure for the turmoil within oneself was offered to us only in forms of action, in helping the wounded in every way possible, or in the wielding of weapons and equipment of war, firing on the enemy. The infantrymen became consumed with a remorseless, ever-increasing rage, and the fevered minds could concentrate only on revenging fallen comrades, to kill the enemy, and to destroy. The highest degrees of rage would grow to suicidal levels, so near together lie fear and courage. During hours of calm, we would sometimes discuss the impact on our lives of living with daily deprivation and danger, and the general consensus reached was that simple men of robust nature often dealt with the situation more effectively, with less personal stress, than do men who are usually considered to be intelligent or sensitive. There exist, however, no rules to guide this philosophy, and it remains inherent upon the momentary situation, which never duplicates itself, as every situation in war is different, and the constitution of the fighter changes with time and experience as well. It is often said that one becomes accustomed to it. One may become accustomed to the threat or constant presence of death. However, throughout the long years of the Russian campaign, helplessly witnessing the badly wounded soldiers in their agony always profoundly affected me far more than when a comrade met an immediate and painless death. He had met his death and was gone, but the cries of the wounded, of our own as well as those of the enemy lying alone between the lines, are often heard long after the guns are silent. In the dim light of an early November sunrise, I sat on the gun carriage of the puck on guard duty, when suddenly the crack of rifle shots and bursts of submachine gun fire exploded from very close range, the shots flying over and behind me. I sprang from the carriage and spun around to see a large number of Russians, no more than 50 paces behind my position, moving quickly among the fruit trees. I was immediately engulfed by an ice-cold sensation as I realized our small unit was cut off from our company. Throwing myself to the ground between the gun limbers, I nervously pulled the stock of my carbine to my cheek, took aim at one of the shadowy figures, and squeezed the trigger. The light rifle recoiled with the shot, and the paralyzing fear immediately melted from me. As I worked another round into the chamber of the bolt-action carbine, our machine gun crew, alerted by the burst of gunfire, scrambled to their gun and frantically swung the cone-shaped muzzle to our rear. Within seconds they were raking the undergrowth among the trees with a sweeping enfilade. My puck crew tumbled from beneath the shelter quarters and raced to my position at the gun. However, it was impossible for us to bring the gun into action without endangering our own forces by the direct fire. The Russians had succeeded in filtering between us and the Tartar houses, where the troops of the 9th and 14th Companies were quartered, and we could see the company troops storming from the houses in the distance as they were alerted by the racing gunfire. A firefight quickly developed among the fruit groves as the Soviets brought a withering fire to bear on our position, and they, in turn, were taken under fire from our main body of troops. As our forces brought heavier fire on the enemy from both directions, the enemy assault unit was effectively destroyed, and those Soviets not killed by the hail of gunfire were taken prisoner. Prisoner interrogations revealed that the enemy force was part of the unit that had attempted to reach the coast through our lines during the previous day. The prisoners were clothed in navy blue uniforms, which appeared to be recently issued and were still immaculately clean. The prisoners stated that they were members of an elite naval infantry unit, and we were impressed by the enormous amount of firepower that had been produced by such a small group of men. All were equipped with semi-automatic rifles or short-barreled submachine guns that were capable of firing 72 rounds from drum magazines. I took one of the submachine guns and several drum magazines from one of the prisoners for my own use, as I no longer placed much faith in the slow-firing 98K carbine for close combat. I felt more confident equipped with the high-capacity automatic weapon, and it was to remain with me for many months. Along a narrow road, an ancient stone wall bordered by a vegetable garden ran between the scattered dwellings, and we knocked stones from the wall to create firing apertures facing our front. Behind our position, we constructed a barricade from the loose stones as protection from enemy mortar and artillery fire directed on our line. In our sector, we remained fortunate, as the high explosive rounds continued to impact at a distance behind us. As we laboured to reinforce our fire position, we were again interrupted by an enemy counterattack. The Soviet naval infantry had crept through the thick undergrowth among the trees to within close range of us, and suddenly silent figures clothed in blue-black rose before us like fleeting shadows in the dawn. The machine gun again exploded into action, accompanied by the barking of our mortars farther behind our line, followed seconds later by the impacting rounds tossing clouds of earth skyward some 150 paces from our position. The enemy advance ground to a halt, and they again evaporated into the undergrowth, leaving their dead and dying behind. While sweeping the area, we came upon an unwounded Russian who had become disoriented, lying behind a ragged tree stump 50 meters from our gun position. With "Stoi! Ruki vverch!" and "Idi suda!" "Halt, hands up and come here," I ordered him to advance toward our position. He stumbled forward with his hands held high, a good-natured grin on his face. We removed 2 hand grenades and a full drum of ammunition from his belt, and a messenger escorted him to our company headquarters. The ever-present, harassing mortar fire continued to haunt our daily lives, with sporadic explosions erupting within our lines without warning. On one occasion, while searching the terrain features opposite us through field glasses, our company commander suddenly stumbled backward, his arms folded across his chest with both lacerated hands held high, blood spurting from open wounds and pouring over his sleeves. A razor-sharp mortar fragment had sliced through the glasses and cleanly severed some of the fingers from both hands. Other than the injuries to his hands, he escaped unhurt, and his communicator accompanied him to the field hospital. On the 5th of November, the division was assigned to take the Belbek Valley near Duvankoy, Gadshikoy, and Bayuk-Otarkoy. The objective was reached that evening, and the assaults that followed during the next 2 days took the form of an arrow-shaped advance that captured a large expanse of outer defences and field positions to the northeast of Fortress Sevastopol. The heights near Mackensia, the town itself, and the commanding terrain feature identified as Hill 363.5 were captured and held through heavy fighting. On the late afternoon of the 7th of November, the regiment ordered our guns to be emplaced on the defence line on the western perimeter of Mackensia. Shortly thereafter, one of the company parks destroyed an enemy tank during a Soviet counterattack. Our tractor bounced over the rough-cut road en route to our new destination, the western range of the Yaila Mountains. The high plateau lying before us was thick with forests and undergrowth. As we observed them from a distance, the gently rising hills and shallow valleys from where we had just advanced gave the appearance of a smooth green and brown carpet. We were provided with a splendid view of the fields surrounding Bakhtshiseray, and the rugged white limestone cliffs to the south were bathed in a soft pink glow against the setting sun. It depicted a serene environment. However, the sound of war resounded from our batteries on the heights, and in return, enemy shells burst sharply on the plateau of Mackensia. About 20 paces from the trail, we came upon a massive concrete embrasure, from which protruded the muzzle of a Soviet rapid-fire cannon, its steel glacis plate rising abruptly in the evening sky. Having only been recently abandoned, it was clearly one of the guns that had caused us such misery as it fired upon us days earlier from these commanding heights. Heavy artillery fire soon began bursting on the cliffs, and we sought protection from the white-hot shell fragments in the abandoned bunker. The design of the huge gun was similar to that of our own 88 mm flak, although on a larger scale and on the heavy breech. Technical information as well as the caliber and year of manufacture, 1938, were deeply stamped in English. We surmised that it must have been manufactured for use as an English or American naval gun. Moments after we had ducked into the bunker, Hartmann drew our attention to our munitions carrier slowly climbing the steep rise behind us, and we prepared for its arrival. Without warning, at a distance of 200 meters, the triple-axle Ford suddenly exploded in raging flames, a plume of black smoke spiraling skyward. The heavy load of ammunition began to detonate with sharp explosions, sending hot shrapnel and intact projectiles raining down on us. The vehicle, obviously having taken a direct hit from a hidden gun that struck the unprotected fuel tank, continued to shower the area with sparks and jagged metal for several hours. After the eruptions subsided, we cautiously approached the vehicle, and eventually the flames died enough to enable us to pull the crumpled and singed corpse of the dead driver from the burning truck. Again with the setting sun came rain. Under dripping shelter quarters hanging from weary shoulders, the gun crews shoveled and hacked a grave into the stony ground for their dead Gefreiter. The shallow grave was dug in silence, each member lost in those private thoughts that inevitably haunted us when we lost one of our own. The men tightly gripped the slippery entrenching tools, the shallow grave was dug, the identity tag was removed from the corpse, and his scorched remains were laid to rest wrapped tightly in a rubberized gas sheet. We shoveled earth on the grave and placed his worn and battered helmet on the mound covering him. It was again difficult to imagine that his journey through life had come to an end, leaving only a steel helmet and a tiny mound of earth on a Crimean hillside. The rain intensified, washing the soil from the crumbling stones we had piled on his grave. In the darkness they gleamed chalk white, reflecting the light from flares bursting and floating in the distance over Mackenzie. The cold rain fell throughout the night, running from the helmet's rim into our collars as we muscled the gun through the thick clay into a defensive position. As dawn began to break against the horizon, we shared hot ersatz coffee with a sentry manning a machine gun position, while he advised us of the strong Soviet counterattacks that had taken place in this sector throughout the previous days. Motivated by his story, we again tore into the earth, digging deeper and piling stones around our gun for protection from the shell splinters. Suddenly and silently, from out of the darkness, poured waves of enemy soldiers. Elite troops of the Soviet naval infantry massed toward us, their ranks reinforced with work brigades drafted from the Sevastopol docks and factories. They assaulted our positions from the thick underbrush before Mackenzie, pouring toward us in dark waves, hoarse shouts of "Hurrah!" erupting from the oncoming line. Springing to our weapons, we, once the attackers, had become defenders, and we prepared to defend our positions, step by step, as bitterly as the Russians had done on these same heights several days previously. We opened fire with high explosives point-blank into the rows of attackers. The roar of battle smothered the cries of the Soviets. The frantic loading of our weapons concealed the terror that had enveloped our ranks. The heavy machine gun nearby burned belt after belt of gleaming ammunition through the feed tray, spent cartridges pouring from the hot receiver in an endless stream. Detonating mortar rounds erupted on the stony ground 50 meters before our defenses, as our mortar teams behind us attempted to stem the advancing waves falling on us. Slowly the assault broke against our lines. The open ground before us was littered with the dark forms of the dead and dying. Only the cries of the wounded could be heard through the ringing in our ears caused by the firing of hundreds of weapons in close proximity. The early pre-dawn air remained heavy and almost asphyxiating from bitter cordite fumes, and through the smoke and dust we could vaguely see the forms of wounded enemy soldiers thrashing in agony before our positions. Within minutes we faced another onslaught, and the sun climbed above the horizon to reveal the full horror of the battlefield. Pushed to hatred and thirst for blood through liberal rations of vodka, the Russians staggered and reeled ahead of the threatening pistols wielded by their commissars, their loud screams of "Hurrah!" again lost in the deafening roar of exploding weapons. Over the din, I heard the machine gunner cry, "I can't just keep on killing!" as he squeezed the trigger and held it tightly, sending a stream of bullets from the smoking MG barrel into the masses of attackers. Our puck projectiles screamed and tore holes in the collapsing ranks. This attack ground to a halt hardly 50 paces from the muzzle of our gun. We were positioned on a critical height strategically located near Mackenzie, and the Red Army was fully aware that if we were permitted to push through to Severnaya Bay, their lifeline would be severed. Thus, in immeasurable numbers and multiple assault waves, spurred on by threats, coercion, and patriotic appeals from political commissars, the Russians threw themselves against us in charging ranks. Motivated by abundant amounts of vodka and facing the angry muzzle of a commissar's pistol for any sign of hesitation, they threw themselves against us again and again. By afternoon we hardly remained conscious as we staggered through air thick with cordite fumes, ears ringing, bodies overcome and exhausted by the exertion and terror of battle. We stumbled weakly over our own legs as we attempted to clear the debris from our gun position. The machine gunners could no longer straighten the fingers of their right hands. The mortar crews could hardly lift their arms from exhaustion. Machine gun barrels, rapidly changed during short pauses between attacks, lay on the ground in dull grey-white piles. Expended shell casings formed glittering heaps and were scattered everywhere underfoot. A heavy silence had fallen on our line. The machine gunner and loader lay collapsed with exhaustion over their gun, staring blankly into the void from where the waves of attackers had come. The pack crew had thrown themselves on the ground, still unable to comprehend the horror of the attack. Behind our lines, the sharp clanging of entrenching tools could be faintly heard as the ringing through our fevered minds slowly subsided. I recalled a story of how some defenders of a fortress during the Middle Ages stacked the dead in rows to be used as emergency defences. Now a comparison came to mind. Dead and wounded Russians lay entangled and thickly scattered before our positions. The heavy underbrush that had protected their advance was shredded and torn by thousands of bullets and shell splinters. With the setting sun, we welcomed the protection of darkness. Throughout the night, the screams of the wounded Russians lying in the no-man's land before our lines continued to haunt us. We strengthened our position and laboured under crates of ammunition. We observed no attempts by the Soviets to recover their wounded, either surreptitiously or under the protection of a white flag. Sleep was impossible. Before our battalion sector, hundreds of enemy dead had hurriedly been counted at the risk of drawing sniper fire. Long afterward, I could still hear the words of the machine gunner in my sleep. "I just can't keep killing." Miraculously, my pack crew had suffered no casualties, although the battalion had suffered numerous losses. The Soviet waves had succeeded in penetrating a section of our line before being thrown back in hand-to-hand fighting. That evening, as we drew munitions and rations from headquarters, we found ourselves passing near the field medical station, and now, with screams from our own wounded ringing in our ears, we attempted to stumble onward. Through the darkness, we followed a pair of stretcher-bearers as they wound by shell craters filled with muddy water. We passed rows of our own dead, wrapped in shelter quarters, waiting for their last journey toward the rear on the pony carts. On this night, however, they had to wait before embarking on their final journey with the German army, as the wounded had transport priority. We could see a young staff surgeon bent over an inert form, working endlessly, assisted by medical NCOs, sleeves rolled up in the dim light of field lanterns. The shelter quarters hung heavy with rain, stretched over the earthworks filled with wounded, and in the yellow light of a hissing lantern, tetanus and morphine shots were administered. Lung wounds were tightly bandaged, arteries were clamped, limbs were wrapped, and shattered bones were set. Our wounded were laid in rows on piles of straw, evacuation tags hanging from their tunics. In filthy, torn uniforms, wrapped with blood-soaked bandages, they filled the air with a confusing mixture of screams, groans, whimpers, and stony silence as they awaited their journey to an unknown destination. In small groups, they were transported to the rear on the pony carts. A bad wound was psychologically shocking to a lancer, regardless of how strong and courageous he may have been, and he would be quickly traumatized by what had smitten him. Overtaken by a feeling of helplessness, he found himself no longer the fighter, but a man at the total mercy of his comrades. Our only thoughts were to flee this nightmare, to escape from this place of filth, misery, and death, far away where no shells would fall. We hastened forward and returned to the familiar comfort of our gun, leaving the suffering behind us. Suddenly, through the crosshairs of the gun optics, I found myself staring directly into the round black muzzle of the enemy gun. Mid to end, November 1941. The nights brought frost. Fortunately, in the Crimea, no brutal Russian winter was expected, and we did not experience the suffering throughout months of sub-zero temperatures to the extent of our comrades on the northern front. In the northern and central areas of the Crimean Peninsula, the winters are much like those we experience in Germany, with frost and snow. However, on the southern coast, the Russian Riviera, it remains relatively mild. The days and nights had already revealed to us that the winter clothing issued in accordance with the Army Service regulations for a German infantry division was entirely too light, especially for the soldiers in the foremost exposed positions. In the front lines, we were compelled to live in open earthworks or behind stone walls, with only a roof of light canvas assembled from shelter quarters. In these primitive shelters, we were exposed to the mercy of the elements and made more miserable with the onset of frost and rain. Rear support units, such as supply and staff, usually took advantage of the opportunity to seek out warm quarters and would house themselves in available Russian dwellings, despite the ability of the large-caliber naval guns from Soviet ships and fortresses to reach these targets far behind us. Enemy fighters and Martin bombers attacked the battery positions, medical treatment centers, supply columns, staff quarters, and other select targets on a daily basis. To add to this stress came the onset of the muddy season. When a thaw came, the trails and roads became bottomless mires. The heavy truck traffic would literally be brought to a standstill. Once again, the supply lines for the forward troops would find themselves reliant on the tireless Ukrainian ponies pulling primitive carts. We in the forward elements had already become hardened by the deprivation and physical exhaustion constantly experienced throughout the previous months. Fighting, marching, and living under open skies while often suffering from thirst and hunger made the Lancers tough and enduring, without a gram of extra fat on the ribs. We learned the art of improvisation and self-sufficiency from the enemy. During the freezing nights, we insulated our bunkers and stonewall shelters with blue Navy overcoats stripped from the enemy dead in front of our positions. The Soviet Army dead provided us with thick brown flannel gloves as well. From somewhere far in the rear appeared instructions advising us that during the sub-freezing nights, the Wehrmacht socks could be used as gloves. Neatly written in precise military terminology was the recommendation that the frontline troops should cut 2 holes in a sock for thumb and trigger finger. Someone was obviously not aware that our boots had been almost worn to scrap and that our socks were little more than rags, already with so many holes in them that we would have no difficulty in finding enough to poke all 5 fingers through. Like the mud in the freezing weather that had descended on us, the front line congealed and solidified. The enemy relentlessly attempted to win back Mackenzie and the southern heights, as well as Duvancoy. Our own forces remained too weak to capture the threatening sea fortress by surprise attacks, and the situation was further complicated by our lack of tanks and heavy artillery. The Soviet Fortress Army was able to win enough time to reinforce and strengthen its position, and to mobilize defenses. With the Soviet fleet holding absolute control of the Black Sea, the fortress was able to receive supplies and reinforcements from the Kuban salient and the Caucasus without difficulty. Our own supply lines were extended for an untenable distance, stretching across the continent from the Crimea to the German homeland. Farther to the north, mechanical failures of the sensitive German locomotives became commonplace as they traversed the Ukraine in the bitter sub-zero temperatures. Whenever a temporary thaw was experienced, the motorized supply columns became mired in the mud of the soft, unpaved roads of the southern Ukraine and northern Crimea. The hard clay roads that had proved to be easily traversable during the dry summer months had become virtually impassable for the mechanized units as they attempted to plough forward through the softened, rain-soaked earth. The supply question alone had become a critical problem for the entire 11th Army. Because of the deteriorating supply situation, the heavy munitions were carefully conserved and could be used only sparingly. The rations became even more monotonous, consisting mainly of a tasteless barley broth mixed with a strange concoction of dried vegetables, derisively referred to by the infantrymen as Draftverhauer, augmented with the standard army-issue cheese squeezed from tubes. Shortly before being relieved by the 24th Saxon Infantry Division on the front lines of Mackenzie, we found ourselves again harassed by the propaganda machinery of the Red Party. We had long since become familiar with the leaflets encouraging us to desert, as tons of them had been dropped on us since our crossing of the Dnieper an eternity ago. The nights were now often filled with the screeching of loudspeakers emitting endless political speeches and crude attempts to convince us to desert to the enemy. German soldiers and workers, throw off the yoke of your oppressing imperialist and fascist clique. Come over to us, the farmer and workers' state. Clean, comfortable beds, beautiful women, good food, and sweet wine await you. And your lives will be spared. This would be followed by the Communist International, to which we usually replied with angry bursts from our machine guns. With monotonous regularity, the routine would resume the following morning. A short time after being relieved on the line, we learned that an area of the sector previously held by our unit was lost to the Russians. We were aware that this setback could just as well have occurred while we occupied the positions. Nevertheless, our replacements were ridiculed by the Lancers as the Tango Division, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So heated became the relationship between the 2 infantry divisions over these words that one of our Oberleutnants and an officer from Saxony were almost drawn into a duel, which had been illegal in the German army for a number of years. Only through the timely intervention of our commander was a serious incident prevented. In December 1941, the company administrative and supply offices were located near Ep.2, a village on the main road leading to Simferopol. It consisted of a genuine cobblestone street over which rolled the main supply column to the Sevastopol front. Before our village was an open area through which motorized vehicles passed only at full speed, and the pony carts clattered and bounced at a gallop. The now familiar phrase, "in view of enemy forces," was known to every driver, and they were fully aware of the danger along this particular stretch of road, even without the signs that were posted to warn personnel of danger. Passing vehicles would predictably draw enemy shells fired from a great distance on the northern sector of the Sevastopol fortress. The heavy 305 mm projectiles, fired from an armoured embrasure on the battlement called Maxim Gorky Wurst, blasted impressive craters along the road. Most of the Lancers heard the name of the great Russian poet for the first time when they questioned the source of these screaming, howling shells that routinely impacted near our position. I never knew if the Soviets themselves had named this massive cannon after the poet, or if it was simply one of the battlefield nicknames that had become widespread by the Lancers whose lives had been made miserable by its presence. Ep.2 lay to the east of this road, artfully nestled in a picturesque valley. It was the old capital of the Crimean Tartars, and was the location of the castle of the Khan, complete with slender minarets and rich filigree work in arches. It was known for its 127 fountains, which, although dilapidated and worn, gave a distinct Oriental impression of pre-Soviet grandeur. In the city bazaar, we observed merchants who often bartered and traded items that would only be considered refuse by us. When word was received that we were to be relieved on the line, we had quickly dispatched our drivers to locate suitable quarters for us in the designated rest area. With their usual efficiency, they immediately had arranged lodging in a small Tartar dwelling. It had a small veranda tastefully framed in carved woodwork, and water was drawn from an open cistern outside. The entire house consisted of 2 living rooms and was sparsely furnished. Along the walls were low benches for sitting and sleeping, and we were provided with a deep copper tub for bathing, a luxury long forgotten. 2 bent and wrinkled Tartar women engaged themselves in preparing hot water for us, and despite our protests, they insisted on stripping the mud-encrusted, threadbare uniforms from our thin frames, followed by earnest attempts to scrub the layers of filth from our bodies as we soaked in unaccustomed lavishness. We finally submitted with relaxed grins to the cleansing, after which we removed stubbles of beard with hot water, soap, and razors. We quickly developed a friendly relationship with the occupants of the house, and we traded bread and saccharin with them in return for tobacco and fresh vegetables. They made it clear to us that the Tartar people were never friends of the Soviets, and that they deeply resented the Russianization of the Crimea, which had resulted in their becoming a minority of lesser status. There were a number of women and children in the house who constantly came and went with abandon, as well as an old man who seldom spoke. All men of military age had apparently been swept up and conscripted into the Soviet army during its retreat. An old woman of undeterminable age would sit like a mummy with a pipe in her toothless mouth, always occupying the same place on her bench. The only time that I ever saw her round face break into a smile was on the occasion when a child was born just before Christmas. Then the old woman came to life and constantly waddled back and forth, caring for the new mother and infant. Several days earlier, we had seen a pregnant woman being carefully delivered to the house, and we experienced the birth of little Ivan with his first cries in the room next to us. Afterward, one of our medics provided them with clean bandages, and we donated the few sweets we possessed to the young mother. Here the Lancers and the Russian women celebrated the birth of new life, while a few kilometers away, the destructive mechanism of modern war could be heard in its full power as the sound of impacting shells echoed across the gently rolling terrain. We were greeted throughout the day by the calls of the Moslem Imam, and we heard his voice singing from the tower of the mosque 5 times daily as he called the Islamic followers to prayer, from sunrise to sunset. When resupplying us during the Mackenzie operations, 2 transportation personnel from our supply column managed to cross over the steep, partisan-infested Yaila Mountains and reach the coastal road near Yalta. With the senses of hungry jackals, they immediately located a captured Russian depot. Adjacent to the barrels of sauerkraut and applesauce was a large store of wine. It was already sealed and closely guarded by Romanian troops, and had been placed under the control of a strict German supply officer. Our 2 soldiers pleaded for permission to take something with them from the depot, but their pleas and sorrowful tales of hunger, cold and thirst in the forward lines were to no avail in softening the heart of the supply officer. The 2 decided to play on the sympathy of the Romanians. With a field lighter and cigarettes, they located a cooperative guard who, during the night, helped them to load several kegs onto their vehicle. The company supply Feldwebel surprised us with 3 large wooden casks of Crimean wine, which arrived perched on the back of a supply vehicle. Told that we should draw a limited ration from the kegs, we drank the deep red, priceless liquid from mess tins and field flasks as we sang The Mills of the Black Forest Valley. Added to our repertoire were a few ribald lyrics, typical of soldiers since time began, and eventually we emptied our battered containers. The driver devised a resupply system from a length of fuel line that ran directly from the casks through the open window to our quarters, where it could not be seen and controlled by our company spies. Unhindered, we continued to drink our fill of sweet Crimean wine throughout the night, in the finest tradition of Peter the Great and Empress Catherine of Russia. The following day, an award document for bestowal of the War Service Cross was prepared in the company administrative office, and a justification for the award was written and acknowledged for the obtaining of indispensable war material, wine. A vote was taken, and the company was unanimous in agreement that the award for our benefactors was in order. Our wounded company commander had returned. Strict but just, he always led the company with exemplary fairness, never asking of his men what he could not or would not do himself. His lacerated hands had been treated in the field hospital at Bakhchisaray, where it had been necessary to amputate some of the mutilated fingers. With bandaged hands, he made his rounds through the company quarters, greeting the Lancers and inquiring about their needs. Despite his wounds, for which he could have been granted convalescent leave, he remained at the front in the company of the troops. Alois, his aide, assisted him in washing and shaving. Weapons and equipment were thoroughly inspected. The drivers constantly checked their vehicles to ensure that the motors fired immediately, even in the sub-freezing temperatures. We remained fully aware that our days of comfort and relative luxury in the rest area were numbered, and we could not escape the thoughts that soon our ordeal of waging war would resume. A pre-Christmas religious service was provided by the division chaplains of both confessions in the Khan's Castle Mosque in Bakhchisaray. The occasion would have remained in our memories as strikingly beautiful, if not for the recent horrors experienced on the Crimean battlefields that remained unforgettable to us. According to the company schedule, and in strict observation of National Socialist political doctrine, attendance at religious events was voluntary, but almost the entire unit marched together to the mosque. Foresight, strength, and faith remained the watchwords during these days of Advent. We longed for peace, and the initial excitement of war had been overcome by the strong desire to resume normal lives. We attempted to find comfort through the words of the priests and chaplains in grey, but our thoughts concentrated on home, the wounded, and the dead. In view of what we had recently witnessed together, and of what we had barely survived, The political philosophies and idealistic rhetoric that had brought us so enthusiastically into this foreign land had evolved into meaningless fragments. The first assault on Sevastopol loomed before us. Together with the 22nd, Lower Saxony Infantry Division, we were assigned to attack the northern front of the enemy. This involved assaulting the complex system of fortifications, embattlements and cliff positions on the northern sector of the Sevastopol stronghold and pushing through to Severnaya Bay. Fully aware that the northern sector held the heaviest defences, we were advised that we must be prepared to take the bull by the horns. With this drive, the enemy was to be denied access to the harbour exit, cutting off any hope of further retreat for the remaining Soviet forces hoping to be evacuated by sea. The Army Command had drawn together all available resources for the attack. Only in the area of Kerch did a German division remain uncommitted to the assault. This division had been assigned the task of coastal security, replacing a weakly equipped Romanian division of questionable reliability. The pressing supply problems had rendered our complement of heavy artillery and munitions hardly sufficient to support a drawn-out, lasting battle. We were also desperately short of armoured personnel, and the few we had available were faced with the immense challenge of traversing difficult terrain while fighting their way through a fortified network of resolute defenders. The Soviets lay deep within a series of fortresses that controlled the battlefield. Our task became increasingly difficult as the weather worsened, bringing pouring rain that alternated with freezing nights to make life miserable for us in the trenches. During the night of 16 the 17th of December, our companies trickled into the forward preparation areas. The strongly defended northern sector of the coastal fortress behind the heights towering over the Belbek Valley covered an immense area from our position toward the east. The rain quietly drizzled throughout the night, but with the sunrise, the day broke clear and calm. At 0500, the assault began against the fortress along the entire Sevastopol front. The division moved forward in a massive wave close behind an immense artillery and smoke battery barrage. The first assault objective, the heights west of a terrain feature designated as Hill 319.9, was taken. Due to the deep emplacement of enemy defensive positions, further ground could only be taken slowly and through the elimination of stubborn pockets of resistance. The enemy defended themselves with skill and bravery, fighting for every foot of ground. Despite the excellent observation positions from the batteries, very few enemy positions were actually visible to the assaulting lancers until they had approached within deadly range of the defenders. To the relief of the infantry, darkness fell early, forcing the foremost assault elements to halt for the night after reaching the first objective. On the 18th of December, the enemy continued to resist stubbornly from defensive positions situated on lines 217 to 253 and extending farther south. Manstein's 11th Army continued to press the assault, pushing the divisions forward at first light toward the northern sector of the fortress. At approximately 0615, the enemy was forced from their defensive positions and pushed past the ravines and gorges south of Kamishli to the heights along lines 226-228. By 1500, almost all objectives had been reached, and further advance was again halted due to darkness. In the pre-dawn hours of the 19th of December, the 132 Days Infantry Division moved forward in attempts to break through the enemy defences and capture the heights northeast of Chernaya and to secure the approaches to Severnaya Bay. Further attacks won ground very slowly against ever-stiffening enemy resistance. Constant counterattacks from desperate naval infantry units were effectively repulsed, and our advance was slowed by previously unreported mortar batteries and long-range naval guns, which covered the line of our advance with a heavy blocking fire. The objectives assigned for that day were finally taken in the early morning of the 20th of December. In the right sector of the division, the town of Kamishli fell to Infantry Regiment 436, and after heavy fighting, Hill 251 was captured by Infantry Regiment 438. The divisions to our left remained hindered by thick undergrowth and almost impassable terrain. Our division, together with the 22nd Infantry Division, was able to penetrate deep into the fortress defences. Our attack formations remained poised like an arrow pointing directly towards Severnaya Bay. The enemy, aware of our attempts to win the harbour approaches, threw new strength into the defences before us. Our point elements found themselves under a hail of bomber and fighter-bomber attacks, which took a heavy toll. It was Christmas Eve, 1941. Even during this holiest of times, a belief shared by soldiers fielded by both antagonists, the unforgiving god of war had taken no holiday. Upon the heights of Kamishli, we settled into our holes and trenches dug into a former Russian field position. From the supply depot in the rear, the rations carriers brought each man a special-issue ration consisting of a canteen of Crimean wine and a loaf of white bread. They also brought mail, the first we had received in many days. In the light of a Hindenburg candle, huddled beneath the now faded and threadbare shelter quarter, I opened a package from home with fingers stiff and sore from cold. The package was not very large. The authorized weight was limited to 2 kilograms. A feeling of homesickness swept over me as I eagerly tore open the crumpled wrapping, and the sweet smell of gingerbread filled our surroundings, contrasting sharply with the acrid smell of unwashed woolen uniforms, heavy leather equipment, grease and oil. I had received a small candle mounted on a tiny star-shaped holder stamped from foil, a snip of evergreen twig from our Black Forest, a small bottle of Schwarzwälder Kirschwasser, and gingerbread, baked by my mother and packed with the greatest of care, using every bit of space possible for the long journey to the east. The frost glittered on the moist wall of the shelter, and our breathing left clouds of vapour hanging momentarily in the still air before being consumed by the darkness. Pressed tightly together, Wolf and I crouched within the damp cave hacked into the Crimean earth, holding our hands close to the inviting warmth of the Christmas candle. We were no longer alarmed by the chatter of the Russian Maxim machine guns that stuttered in the distance, and we had come to ignore the shots cracking overhead. Our eyes stared into the candlelight from under the rims of cold steel helmets, battered and worn by the months of constant use. Wolf's downy cheeks revealed his youth. However, his eyes betrayed the years of a young man forced to grow old before his time. We had become old together and had developed a brotherhood between us, a closeness of spirit and trust that those who live in safety throughout their lives cannot know. He pulled a harmonica from his tunic pocket and softly played the traditional songs from home, O Tannenbaum, and Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. 2 lancers from the neighbouring foxhole heard the harmonica and crept across the frozen ground to our position. With knees drawn beneath us, we were tightly pressed within the confines of our shelter, our bodies providing sparse but much-needed warmth for one another. The camaraderie that we experienced, the knowledge that each of us shared the longing to depart this place forever, softened the homesickness that we felt during these hours. The contents of the Christmas packages were equally divided. The wine from the canteens sent warmth through our cramped limbs. Once again, Wolf played the songs on the harmonica, and with voices hoarse with cold, we sang softly to the music. Outside, beyond the light of our candle, a flare sizzled skyward and cast ghastly shadows as it floated slowly over the frozen ground. Nearby, a Russian machine gun momentarily broke the stillness and was immediately answered by the bark of a sniper's rifle slightly forward of our position. Silence quickly descended on the lines again, although there remained no peace on earth. After midnight, the gun crews, led by the platoon commanders, assembled in the tank trenches that had been captured earlier the previous day by our infantry battalion. With picks and entrenching tools, we set to work improving the trenches, no longer feeling the cold as we cut through the frost-hardened earth. The sky was suddenly illuminated when a Russian, some 200 meters distant, sent a flare sizzling toward the heavens. We threw ourselves flat on the ground and lay still until the flare, which floated lazily toward the earth for what seemed an eternity before striking the ground, sputtered furiously for a moment and extinguished itself. We sweated and strained against the gun as we wrestled it into position, and the morning horizon was growing light as the last heavy cases of ammunition were finally in place. We rested against the walls of the tank trench our still figures draped with shelter quarters heavy with frost, and waited in silence before receiving word to post sentries. In the growing light of Christmas Day, we further explored the immediate area and found shelter in a former Soviet bunker near the tank trenches. The shelter was well built, constructed of thick tree trunks lying in various positions and dug deep into the clay. The enemy, fully aware of the location of this structure, which they had abandoned only hours previously, soon targeted their former bunker. Once again we found ourselves under a barrage of artillery fire, and just as during the countless barrages we had previously experienced, we resigned ourselves patiently to waiting out the hail of explosives falling about us. In a corner of the bunker we located a small wood-burning stove. We engaged ourselves in roasting bread until the exploding projectiles from a 172 mm gun crept closer to our position, shaking the earth and tossing fountains of dirt and debris skyward. With every explosion, soil was shaken from the rafters, and hunks of earth rained on our shoulders and helmets. Instinctively, we retreated to a far corner and pressed ourselves against the walls. Shell splinters and fragments of stone tore through the shelter quarter hanging in the entrance and bounced throughout the bunker. The barrage suddenly died, and as silence enveloped our position, we began to hope that the rain of shells was over, but suddenly we were overwhelmed by a tremendous explosion. Without warning, the blast from a massive shell exploded on the bunker and slammed us against the earth, leaving us dazed and almost unconscious. We staggered weakly to our feet, choking on cordite fumes and groping futilely through the thick smoke, unable to hear the cries of our wounded through the ringing in our ears. The blinding dust and smoke eventually cleared enough to reveal a large hole in the ceiling, through which filtered the cold grey light of the December day. 3 of the thick timbers had been shattered like matchsticks by the enormous projectile, and tons of earth, which moments before had rested on the timbers, now lay piled before us. We frantically began clawing at the mountain of dirt, using bare hands and helmets to shovel the heavy clay in attempts to free our missing comrades. With hands torn by stone fragments and wood splinters, we pulled 2 wounded men from the debris. Boer was unconscious, with blood running over his face, and the other man had received injuries in both legs. He was unable to walk, and we suspected that he had suffered some broken bones. He appeared to be otherwise unhurt, and he remained talkative and alert, despite obvious pain. Several minutes after Boer regained his senses, we completed the bandaging of his wounds. Of a total of 6 men in the bunker, miraculously, only 2 had received more than superficial injuries. Most of us had escaped serious injury or death due to our position at the rear of the bunker, and we had been saved by a heavy supporting wall when the shell struck directly in the centre of the structure. When surveying the damage, we were all acutely aware of what fate would have dealt us if we had been directly beneath the impacting shell, where the shattered timbers and tons of earth had come to rest. Our chimney and bunker stove were completely destroyed, and the cold began pouring through the exposed ceiling. We placed Boer on a self-propelled gun to be taken to the medical aid station. The shells continued impacting throughout the area, and a Russian flak battery located on a railway line began taking our position under direct fire. Understandably, under these conditions, the other wounded soldier refused to leave our position, choosing instead to wait until evening to be evacuated on the rations carrier. I reluctantly agreed to let him remain with us until evacuation could be accomplished in relative safety. Later that afternoon, the shelling increased to a steady, uninterrupted barrage, and our position fell under further direct fire from Russian small arms and howitzers. It became necessary to delay the evacuation of the wounded soldier until the following morning. Several days later, we received word that he had died from gangrene complications that developed in the field hospital. In view of the nature of his wounds, I believe his death would have been avoided if he had received immediate medical attention from the field surgeon. Thereafter, I was determined to act on my better judgment and to seek treatment as soon as possible for the wounded, rather than to comply with their personal requests, which were usually made under the influence of great pain. During the night of the 26th of December, my gun crew crossed the tank trench and moved forward. At the bottom of the trench were lying a number of our comrades. They lay still and cold in death, wrapped in shelter quarters for burial, and we filed past them with eyes averted. The casualties had been heavy, and we attempted to dwell on other things, on what destiny would hold for us within the next minutes or hours. We lay before the rail embankment that led toward Mekensievi Gori. Despite harassing fire from enemy small arms, each pack was flanked by 2 men digging in and camouflaging the guns with a cover of grass and branches. We had received no warm food throughout the previous 2 days, and Wolf and I volunteered to serve as rations carriers. Shortly before dusk, we worked our way toward the rear, following our tracks back over the tank trench and onto a rise, from where the enemy could be observed from a close distance. Machine gun bursts cracked and sputtered behind us as we scrambled across the open ground, darting from cover to cover until we gained the safety of a small copse of trees. As we sprinted into the grove, a flak gun positioned on the railway fired into the treetops above us, and we ducked instinctively as splinters and branches crashed to earth around us. With pounding hearts, we finally reached our former bunker position and located the supply drivers, who issued us rations that had been reheated from the previous day. While we were drawing our rations, a number of Ilyushin II fighters appeared on the horizon, and we watched them attack the foremost positions. They flew low and fast, dropping 50K fragmentation bombs directly on our company, banking and returning to the attack with board cannons and machine guns. During a pause in the air attack, we made our way forward in the growing dusk with the steaming ration canisters strapped to our backs. As we approached our position, the platoon commander, Oberfeldwebel Weiss, stared at us in astonishment for several seconds before leaping to his feet. During our absence, my entire gun crew had become casualties. 2 Lancers had moved into our position immediately following our departure, and a Brissance bomb had scored a direct hit on the foxhole. They had died instantly when the bomb struck, and the platoon commander had unknowingly reported Wolf and me as killed in action. The men of the platoon wordlessly celebrated our return from the dead by hungrily devouring the hot food. We attempted to turn our thoughts from the loss of the 2 Lancers. We had experienced too many casualties to concern ourselves at this moment with what could not be avoided, so we simply accepted the losses and continued to concentrate on our own survival. In the past 6 months, we had crossed an enormous span of time and consciousness. The strength of the infantry companies had been reduced from 80 to an average of about 20 men. Despite these losses, the companies had been continually thrust into the fighting around Sevastopol fortress, had succeeded in breaking through layers of defences, and in fierce fighting had captured numerous strongpoints. Throughout the months of surviving in a brutal, unforgiving environment, each individual infantryman had exhibited remarkable endurance and adaptability while living in the open elements, under the harshest of conditions, with only field rations for sustenance. My Puck platoon now consisted of only 2 guns, which were normally served with a crew of 4 men to each gun. With 2 additional men, Wolf and I began training another gun crew. On the evening of the 27th of December, the infantry regiments prepared to launch a fresh attack. Part of the 50th Infantry Division was assigned to strengthen the left sector perimeter. At 0700 on the 28th of December, our forces pushed forward. The attack had been precipitated by a massive barrage from our artillery. The Nebelwerfer rocket launchers fired multiple projectiles that screamed over us, leaving long blue-white trails behind them before bursting on the enemy positions. Prisoners confirmed that the Nebelwerfers were much feared by the Soviet soldiers, who called them the bellowing cows. We referred to the rapid-firing Russian Katyusha rockets as Stalin's organs. We crouched in our forward positions and prepared to advance toward the enemy. The minutes passed slowly. The Lancers nervously smoked final cigarettes in silence, thoughts racing through their minds of the impending assault, of wives and children, of mothers and fathers, of the bodies seen the previous night, lying still and cold, wrapped in shelter quarters. Futilely we attempted to concentrate only on the moment at hand. The machine gunners again inspected the actions and feed trays of their weapons, ensuring that their gleaming belts of ammunition were free of mud and sand so as not to jam the sensitive locking mechanisms of the weapons. Hand grenades were stuck into leather field belts and into the tops of our Nobelbecker. A Gefreiter silently crossed himself in prayer, others pretended not to notice. As the final minute neared, the squad leaders sought to reassure the men, and with encouraging words they attempted to persuade us that with our battle-torn and weakened companies we could again accomplish the impossible. The artillery barrage crept ahead, and wordlessly the ranks moved forward. After heavy fighting, Mekensivigori was taken. The numbers within the companies were fewer than ever. We positioned our puck close to the Mekensivigori train station, which offered us shelter next to a stone wall from the ever-present artillery rounds impacting at random throughout the area. The night was spent huddled beneath an immobilized Russian tank. During the night, snowfall covered the torn earth like a white linen cloth, as if attempting to cover the wounds of war. Only a few ugly black splotches revealed the fresh impact locations of the shellfire, and the light from a full winter moon illuminated the gleaming landscape with a silver frosting. Before dawn, Wolf and I requisitioned a white bedsheet from an abandoned house, with which we camouflaged the armoured gun shield of the pack. In the grey morning light of the 29th of December, we took shelter in a low stone house. It was solidly built, with thick walls of natural stone through which stared broken window panes. We later learned that it had previously been the home of the Mekensivigori railway station master. The air was cold, and we heated the stove built into the wall with splintered fragments of furniture. Somewhere Wolf found a small sack of potatoes, which we sliced for roasting on the iron stovetop. The aroma of the potatoes filled the primitive surroundings, and a wisp of smoke rose from our quarters into the still, milky morning sky.